Hello, listeners, and welcome to part 2 of this mini-series on the children of God with Whisper and Jemima, co-hosts of the Butterflies and Bravery podcast. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast. And if you'd like to learn more about butterflies and bravery, you can follow the links in the episode description. For early access to ad-free, full-length episodes, you can visit patreon.com/the Cult Vault and support this podcast from only £1 a month. But for now, here is Whisper and Jemima. I spoke to an individual yesterday about his experiences growing up in a family cult with a very abusive father who had very staunch political views, and he would use his extreme ties to socialism. He would bring those same values into the home, and through an amalgamation of physical and sexual abuse and staunch politics, indoctrinated his own children into basically thinking the same way politically, but also creating an environment of coercive control through fear. And one of the things that I spoke about with Brendan, my guest, was his difficulty in trying to reconcile sexual abuse as an adult and trying to separate that from your abuser, who there's this man who he is scared of, who is abusing him, but also making him physically feel good at the same time. And he couldn't reconcile those things in his mind. And I've never had a conversation after so long of doing this podcast where somebody worded it in that way. And I do remember reading conflicting things in Faith Jones' book about seeing everybody engaging in sexual intercourse and thinking, I don't want anybody to touch me, but also in an internal race to reach adulthood, because you could then do all of the things that the adults said you needed to do to be good with God. Do you remember any of those conflicting things, Whisper, when you were around the age of 8? Any of those internal struggles of you thinking, I don't want to do this, but also this is what I'm supposed to do?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We were just talking with someone earlier we interviewed, and the way that she worded it, she said that she didn't think of it in ways of whether she believed or she didn't believe. It just was. And that's so the conflict was very internal. It was, this is life. I didn't know that there was any other different way to live. Like, it was almost like, this is my fate. Like, I know that this is going to happen. How can I avoid it as much as possible, while at the same time wanting to be good, wanting to be loved, wanting to be right in God's eyes. So that was the crossroads all the time of like, this does not feel right at all, physically, in any way, in my body or in my mind. But they had already at that point like got us to that mentality of like, I'm only worthy of any type of love, whether it's a family, parent, or a leader, or God. I'm only worthy of love if I'm obeying. And so that was part of obeying. So that was always the conflict.
Especially, I imagine if you're being praised for, if somebody was to donate a significant amount or significant things to the group, and you're being praised for your involvement in raising those funds. I think as a child, or you just want to be recognized, and you just want people to tell you, that you're doing a good job, even if you don't really recognize what it is. And also, you can't express negative emotion in the group, or you get punished, berated, paddled. So if you're seeing
Mm-hmm.
adults engage in these types of activities, and they're doing it happy, and they're doing it dancing, and they're doing it laughing, and then you think, well, this can't be a bad thing, even if that's how you're feeling in yourself.
Yeah. I mean, I especially like those years of like uh 10, 11. I really believe that I was being trained for what was to come. And that's what I thought was meant to happen, because so I had my issues with the outside coming in, with the flirty fishing people, but within the homes too, like there was no safety, there was no safety. I knew that whatever home that we went to for our weekly fellowship, we'd always stay the night, and I was always in trouble that night. Like I was in danger that night, I should say. I always knew, okay, this is what this means when we go over to another place. But it was also happening in the home that I was too. It was really difficult for me to understand why my parents wanted this for me. That's, and I'm years and years and years later, I still wonder the same thing. So
Jemima, you mentioned that you went to Mexico to attend the training camp. Is this the same training camp? I mean, do both of you, you might not want to do this to protect yourselves. Do you read any publications that are written by other members of or former members of the Children of God?
She does. I don't.
There's
what
a
do you mean?
well, there's a part
Like
in
books like Lauren's book and Daniela's book and
Oh,
you know.
okay. Yeah,
there's a
okay.
part in Faith Jones's book where she mentions a woman coming over to their farm who she's carried out, she's supposed to have been sent from the higher ups, and she's been carrying out this training in another part of the world, and she's now rolling it out into other communes around the world. And the first place she is sent after the initial testing is to Faith Jones's farm where she's living with her family, and her brother is then put into a room. I believe it's or like an outhouse where he is put in isolation and put on silence restriction. So it sounds as if in my mind I'm kind of connecting that this may have been that initial training that took place, the one that you actually went to in Mexico.
Yeah, it could have been. They had a huge like training push to train all the adults to go out and torture the kids. But yes, there was actually, I kind of wonder if she's talking about the same person we were talking about earlier. There was one specific woman who was sent to apparently a lot of places, because we've met various people who've spoken today. Somebody's spoken about the same person and with the same shudders of horror as soon as you think of her. It's like she literally was probably the worst person I've ever met in my life. Like the kind of person that didn't mind grabbing you by the back of your head and ripping your hair out, that loved to torture people. And I'm pretty sure that that's why they chose people like that. And yeah, the teen training camps, that's exactly what they were. It wasn't just training for us. It was training for the adults too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
There was a mention of how the woman would communicate with you one way, which made you kind of feel like you could trust her and that she was a nice person. And then all of a sudden, when any type of punishment was due, or if you would do something that this person didn't agree with, there would be the reaction that was sort of in keeping with what you've just explained there, Jemima. Do you remember this woman kind of being like, you need to tell me about this because it's for your own good, and then as soon as you do tell her because she's made you feel safe, she's then getting out the paddle?
Yep.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, she
I mean,
was very much that way. Now I understand. It's just a typical narcissist. I mean, now I'm like, okay, I get that. I get what you are and what you're doing and the patterns that you're going to follow.
Yeah. But that was a really big thing though, like especially in Thailand, like from about 16 is when that really started. Like they would tell you to be honest. They wanted you. We always go through some they'd set out some big, movement. This needs to happen, um, and then you would reap the repercussions after that. Like whatever that was, you'd be put in isolation. You'd have this happen. You'd have that happen. I think the teen training camps, I would say, is where I would pinpoint that our spiritual and mental abuse started.
Yeah.
In its height, because up until that point, I mean, we had fear of physical fear. We had sexual abuse, physical abuse, that type of a thing, but we are still too young to be fully manipulated. Whereas once the teen training camp started, then now we're starting to talk about like the fear of God and the fear of you being, not right, or like you failing, like that kind of stuff started really in earnest. And
Yeah.
It's still hard to say to this day. It's still hard to say what was worse. Like what is more, what has been more like long-term damage. I mean, that I don't know what I experienced that I would say caused the most long-time damage, but the mental and spiritual abuse was very intense.
Yeah. And the silence restriction and isolation, that was
Yep.
a common practice. I mean, all over the whole world, that was a common practice. Almost every one of us at some point experienced either isolation or silence restriction or both.
Do you recall, Jemima, the length of time that you were placed onto a silenced restriction?
I've actually blocked out that bit quite a lot. I actually just remembered yesterday or today that I was even on silence restriction. Like my memory was telling me, no, we never did that. And then I was started telling Whisper a story today. I was like, holy crap, I was on silence restriction. Because I was like, and then they put us on silence restriction. I was like, oh my God. So I think I was only on for maybe a couple weeks, but I spent 1 month in solitary confinement, and I mean solitary confinement, with one problem teenager, because I was supposed to be the adult or whatever, even though I was 18 or 17 years old myself. And then I spent 3 months in solitary confinement and isolation with another problem teenager. So it was solitary for them, but it was solitary for me too, because I wasn't allowed to speak to anybody else or have any other actions with anybody else either, because that would be a bad sample for them. And that wasn't blah, blah, blah. They had to be with me 24 hours a day. We slept alone in a cubicle, removed from everybody else. We did activities by ourselves. We ate separately. We did everything separately. That was very emotionally damaging, I think.
Few individuals that I've spoken to who are also former members have explained that some of the darkest moments in their recollections are in relation to silence restriction and isolation. And I think that only speaks to how you must feel as a child or a young person being forced into those conditions. It's like prisoner of war conditions, but you're
Yeah.
so small and you're so vulnerable.
Yeah. That's exactly the way
what
that
we said.
That's exactly the way that we try to explain it to people, because I think that's the best way that anybody could possibly comprehend what it was like. And it was like being born a prisoner of war, or a prisoner of a war that wasn't even being fought, though. It's just, a prisoner of an imaginary war, I guess you would say. But yeah, that's what our lives were like. I keep trying to tell people, like, imagine being born in the military. That's what our lives were like. Not from birth, but from 12 years old, which is when you're, forming pretty much everything in your life. That's when the like serious control started. Like lining up. I mean, one of the worst parts in the Philippines was the showers, because we had 1 hour and we had 30 people to take a shower. So we lined up naked and stood naked for an hour, and they stood with a stopwatch in a tiny bathroom. And I mean, just enough for a toilet and a bathtub. You could barely fit in there. One person with the stopwatch, the other person there grabbing you out with a towel. And you went in the backside. They set the stopwatch 2 minutes. They pulled you out. If you weren't done, too bad. You weren't allowed to cut your hair. So we all had long hair, thick hair. How were you supposed to wash your hair in 2 minutes? Like, I don't even know how that's possible. But basically, you didn't, like, you just got in and got out as fast as you could. So, like, even today, showers are like traumatizing and difficult for me, because I mean, like, that's not normal. Like, that is prisoner of war type of thing. That's the kind of thing that people don't do to other people.
Mm-hmm. I think what's interesting too is when you mentioned about, you know, some of the people's darkest experiences was that isolation or that silence restriction, is because we talked earlier today with our guest about belonging and what that meant, you know, wanting to belong. We were told that we did not belong to the world. So in essence, we only had one tribe, and that was the cult. It wasn't like, oh, I can go to school and I have my group of friends there that helped me escape this hellhole that is my house, or vice versa, or I have grandparents that will, you know, there wasn't these different factions or different areas that you could belong to. There was one belonging. There was one, and you belonged to the cult. And so the threat of being cut off from that is like getting cut off from everything. Like there it's terrifying, really, is what it was.
I mean, of course, you had to, read all these things and fulfill all these requirements. And they would often have people in solitary do like extreme, difficult, like exercises. Like, they would make us duck walk for a quarter of a mile, which is like, oh, now I'm 50 and my knees are shot. I wonder why. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
that helped. But like, kids would be passing out because it's the Philippines and it's hot, and we literally would do calisthenics and exercises until we pass out on the floor. And even then it'd be like, get up, let's go, we're not done.
Mm-hmm.
When I spoke to Angela, who is a British former second generation member, she mentioned these experiences, and she also said that the reason why this became such an integral part of the children of God was because there had to be some type of control measure to stop you from becoming systemites. The first generation individuals, they bought into it, and they've stayed as it's grown into this kind of grotesque thing that it's become. But you haven't chosen as second generation members to join and stay with this group. So these measures were put in place to indoctrinate you further into
Absolutely.
not being able to leave. Would you say, Whisper, that would be why these measures were brought in?
Oh, 100%, yes. I mean, the whole point, especially once, you know, we became teenagers, once we started becoming teenagers, their whole point was to break down the individual. We weren't, you know, you couldn't keep they would make you change your name, you know. There was these constant, like, you could never know what was going to be a rule one day, and then what was, and if it was going to change the next day. Like, things that made no sense whatsoever, like all of a sudden it would be a rule. And uh and they would, and they had this thing that they called this publication that they called traumatic testimonies, traumatic teen testimony, something like that, where people from the first generation who had had terrible experiences in the outside world wrote stories about it, and like group, like, make it the worst that they could possibly make it. And then, you know, like, they would, like, here's your bedtime story. We were like, I think I was 16 the first time it happened. I sat through a couple of times, but you know, there was this one person in the group who uh had lost an arm and had another very, very mangled arm, and he would come and he would tell us that he left the cult, and that's when he went and had this huge accident. He's lost his arm, and his other arm got mangled and sawmill. And as soon as he got healed, he ran back to, you know, the family, because he knew that's what would happen. If you left, you were going to become a drug addict. Like they wouldn't let anybody from the outside world talk to you unless they were doing very badly. Like, you know, like somebody like a relative or something, like the story had to be bad. And as long as the story was bad, then maybe you could hear it. But definitely, you know, I mean, that the outside world was like terrifying, you know, like we like really believed it was just a nightmare to be outside of the cult.
In regards to, you know, if social services were to ever, or child protective services were to ever come and ask you questions, do you both remember kind of being coached in that deceivers yet true kind of mentality?
Oh yeah, more than coached. I actually lived in a home that they called the open home. And that's
Mm-hmm.
where they took anybody that wanted to come and see the cult and the way that we operated. Anybody that had questions about whether or not the cult was okay, they'd send them there. All the police, all the military, everybody. And it was a beautiful house. I mean, 20-foot walls, just ignore that part, right? Beautiful house, beautiful property. But that's common in Thailand to have 20-foot walls around your house. Almost anybody that has any money does, because otherwise you're going to get your shit stolen. So um, they would clear out like half of the families. They'd all go to the park for the day. Oh, kids, we're all going to go to the park for the day, just so they could show off this perfect house with this perfect amount of children and the perfect amount of people. And we would be, I mean, it was huge. In Thailand, there's tons of weird, like, what do you call those? um, cultural things, you know, like you have to give people things like this. You can't just hand them it. You got to put your hand on your elbow, and then you have to bow your head. Your head can never be above theirs if they're older than you. So you have to
Mm-hmm.
come into the room on your hands and knees and
Mm-hmm.
exit backwards, because showing the soles of your feet is extremely offensive to a Thai person. So there was not only this entire cult thing that we had to do, but we also had to pretend to be culturally compliant, I guess. So it was a huge, massive, like a play production almost.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody would get dressed up. We would rehearse for days, weeks, months if somebody was going to come through.
That's somebody
All
big,
the
yeah. Like,
questions. We'd have workshops and break up, and like they had scripts that you had to memorize of exactly what you were to say. It was serious.
and then once and it became very earnest once like the Australian raids and the court case in England, when that started coming up, then it just became in absolute earnest. We were to memorize and be prepared at any moment to be raided. I was in one home where they came and they actually had some of the members, the adults, leave the house in the middle of the night and ring the doorbell and yell that it was the police. Kids screaming, like, I mean, just
Chaos.
terrifying, just terrifying that, you know, the daylights out of everybody. And I got sent to a home where there was a woman who had left the cult and that was suing for custody of her underage daughter, and they wanted to prepare her to be ready to go and face allegations and all that kind of stuff. So they took a few of us and they sent us to this one home, and we were still, I think you were not in the country at the time, Jemima, you were probably in Russia.
I was in Russia.
Mm-hmm. And they and we got yeah, a lot like Jemima said, just hours and hours of memorization, and then they would do these like tests on us, ask us questions, and we had to have an answer for every single one. We got in that particular time, they also got a little bit strange where they wanted us to understand the spirit behind why we would do things. So like they had us do things like and have a naked communion, which, you know, as a teenager, it's like a nightmare. And, you know, read some of the old, like the really way out there, like the flirty fishing, even though that was no longer happening. Like they wanted us to read all the, like the most, what do you call it? Like since the most sensationalized things that were there. Like we had reading assignments for that, so we could be ready to answer whatever the person might ask us.
It's interesting that you mentioned, Whisper, that in terms of the outside world and you know, being involved with systemites and the system, that all of these horror stories were being read to you when the worst things that anybody could imagine were happening inside the group anyway. Isn't that like the most mind-bending tactic to use on people, to tell them that outside is where all of these things will happen, but they're already happening inside and have been for a number of years? That's so hard to wrap your mind around, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you would think yes, but because I mean, we were like we lived an upside down world, like so the bad things that could happen to you are like you're displeasing God, and you're gonna get sickness, and you're gonna get like anything that bad happened was a punishment. So even if even bad things that happened to you when you were in the group, uh there would be like you'd have to find out why God wanted you to be sick. Like it was a, a burn in the kitchen. You'd burn your arm in the kitchen because you're cooking for 200 people, but you got a burn that somebody else splashed on you. But you get down on your hands and knees and you don't come out of that room for 2 days until you have an answer of why God did that to you. Like, so, so, so the bad stuff, like, oh, so and so, like they're a drug addict now. Like that was shown as so much worse than somebody that just like, you know, like, you know, because I had struggled a lot with some of the abusive things that had happened to me, and sexual abuse. And I had when we were going through all that about like what do you answer, they were worried about me because I had stories. um and one of the leaders said to me that if I wasn't so self-righteous and uptight, I would be able to admit that I enjoyed what happened to me.
Oh my goodness.
So, so you're like there's no wiggle room for you to be anything other than absolute compliance, absolute compliance, you know? And you couldn't question why things were happening, because if anything that happened bad, you know, it was because you were bad. If anything happened, if you did anything good, well, it's not because of you, it's because you let Jesus shine through you. So I mean, like they erased the the person that you were. Like that was the whole thing. And so especially, you know, teenagers, when we're supposed to be coming into those years of understanding our independence and who we are in relation to the world and our belonging and all that stuff. I told my kids, I said, you know, it's your job to rebel when you're a teenager. That's what I told them. I was like, that's what you're supposed to do. It's literally your job. But absolutely not. It's like they came prepared for any type of rebellion. They were well prepared.
I did some training for some vulnerable children that I was working for before I left work and started the podcast, around brain development and how it is actually a part of a child's natural development to push boundaries, to take risks, and to actually go against the primary caregiver's rules. Because it's all about learning how to be independent, and children can't learn those fundamental skills unless they are doing things like taking risks, breaking rules, and pushing boundaries. So you're right there when you say it's actually your job as a child to come in at 10 p.m. when I've told you to come in at 9 p.m. and so on. And I think that that's a really interesting thing. And it it just shows how effective and how damaging tactics are in these destructive groups when children have literally parts of their development like squashed so that those things don't happen. And you have to wonder how much that affects individuals for the rest of their lives. And I'm sure that these are discussions and thoughts that both of you have together and with yourselves all of the time, even today. And that's another reason why these conversations and things like the Butterflies and Bravery podcast is so important, because it gives individuals a chance to understand those things from people that have experienced them firsthand.
Yeah.
Because
So
when you're breaking down the individual, like that means there's no such thing as boundaries, because the individual is not there. So many of us that came out like little puppies or sheep out into the world and ended up in, horribly abusive relationships, horribly abusive jobs, horribly abusive situations, and not even understanding that we had the right to not have bad things happen to us.
that is the end of part 2 in this mini-series on the children of God with Whisper and Jemima, the co-hosts of the Butterflies and Bravery podcast. For more on Butterflies and Bravery, you can follow the links in the episode description. And to get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.